Atlas Fallen was one of my most anticipated games of the year, and when it finally released, I took a look at Metacritic, which is probably something I shouldn't do, but this is a new independent title, and the reviews were not exactly kind. A 64 on Metacritic is not a great score, and it's probably one of those scores in which you can really not recommend a game unless it's on a deep sale, but it left me wondering, is Atlas Fallen that bad? After 11 hours with the game, I say no, but I am going to also say that every criticism that was levied toward this game is absolutely correct. And in this video, we're going to talk about the 3 things that are really holding this game back from being one that you can recommend to your friends. And we're also going to talk about the things that Atlas Fallen absolutely nails. Probably the most glaring issue that Atlas Fallen has at the moment is its camera. And I think combat in this game is serviceable. I think there are enough abilities to help you create a diverse skill set. I do wish there were more weapons for you to unlock, especially in a game that is roughly 10 to 15 hours and possibly more if you want to 100% this game. But combat itself is serviceable, but the camera is the real enemy. The camera in this game is terrible. And the first time you get into a fight, which is in the tutorial section, which by the way, I did not like at all. I thought it was completely bland. You have to fight enemies on an uneven plane. And what happens is that the camera will try to shift itself downward. So you're more than likely looking at the ground or it's just bouncing all over the place. And in a game in which you are fighting multiple enemies at the same time, you cannot have a bad lock-on camera, especially because you are going to be trying to dodge and parry a lot. And having a camera this poor, especially in critical boss fights when you're playing on medium or hard, is going to end up in a lot of cheap deaths. As you move further and further into Atlas Fallen, you're going to notice that most of the fights that you encounter, especially with the larger enemies, are going to require you to utilize your lock-on camera to target different limbs. The problem is that most of these fights are going to require you to stave off multiple enemies at the same time, because at certain points when you're doing damage, enemies will stop and summon more enemies to come in and give you a bit of grief. So when you have this lock-on camera and it automatically tries to lock on to a limb, but then you just gently flick your right stick and it immediately locks onto an enemy behind them or off into a corner, the camera immediately zips. So you're then forced to kind of really fight freely and just pay attention to the threat indicators, which by the way, those are hit or miss as well. But when the camera is so chaotic, it makes combat just not fun, especially when you get to the last section of this game, when you are fighting really difficult enemies who are spawning in incredibly tough enemies that do a ton of damage. There were multiple times in some of these fights where the camera would just freak out and pin me into the corner or underneath a leg, and all I was doing was swinging wildly, healing, and trying to dodge out of the way. I found the camera to be the worst thing about this game, and it kills you a lot, especially when you get to that last section of the game. Next up, we have to talk about how bare the world is. One of the weirdest things about Atlas Fallen is that in this world full of all of these crazy creatures and monsters, there is barely any of them to challenge you. And it really only feels like they show up in certain areas or sections if a relic piece is there. Beyond that, you're mostly traveling and there's just no enemies. And it's such a weird thing to me, because I really feel like there should be more events in this world where I can kind of show up and save a citizen or save a group of knights or whatever, but that doesn't happen. It's a pretty bare bones world. And if you've played a number of open world games, you're going to want to play these games in which there are dynamic events happening constantly. And the only dynamic event that happens is when the Watcher, which is this massive totem in the sky, shows up and then forces you to get into a mini boss fight or a field boss fight. But you can actually easily escape those because your character is so fast when they sand surf, they can get out of danger pretty quickly. And once you unlock the air dash, you're just kind of zooming in and out of encounters. So I always felt like when this world, which by the way is beautifully designed, it looks really cool, it just doesn't have enough enemies or dynamic events in it to make it interesting. And I cannot stress enough about how disappointing it is because this world has so many cool shortcuts in it that can only be unlocked when you get the crush ability. And when you get that final ability, it really opens up exploration in this game. And the thing is, when you get the crush ability and it's practically near the end of the game, it's when it's practically over, you're probably burnt out by just how bland exploration is up to that point. The crush ability really helps you open up chests, open up certain hidden doors, open up certain hidden platforms, and it really makes exploration fun, but you have to kind of beat yourself up to get there. And I feel like if the developers had just given you all of these tools near the middle of the game and then had the crush ability be a part of certain puzzles at that point, I think it would have been a far more satisfying experience instead of you having to kind of suck it up until you got there. Because it just felt like you have this great looking world and there's practically no real dynamic events to speak of. It doesn't really have a lot of great side quests. There's nothing really out of the ordinary. It does have a number of really cool platforming puzzle sections, but the best sections of the game are more than likely hidden behind that crush ability, and that's really frustrating, and I don't understand why the developers thought it was a good idea to hold that back until the end of the game. The last thing that's really holding Atlas Fallen back is that it probably has one of the most bland opening sections in a game that is marred by certain technical issues, the introduction of a bad camera, and some of the worst voice acting I have ever heard in a video game. It seriously, at times, felt like I was listening to a bargain bin title from the early 2000s. I've always felt that the opening sections of a game are critical to its success because with a new IP, you're going to want to capture your audience's attention by having this amazing opening scene. Here's the problem. The opening section for Atlas Fallen is pretty good because there are a number of crazy things happening. You're getting introduced to this world, you're seeing how the gauntlet works, all of that stuff. The problem is Niall, and that's the spirit that inhabits your gauntlet, which is what you utilize throughout the entirety of the game, has some of the worst voice acting I've heard. And that also extends to a number of characters in the introductory section, and it makes all of these critical moments, especially when they're trying to tell you the backstory of this world, it makes them unintentionally hilarious. And that's a problem, especially when it comes to immersion. Because here's the thing, if you think that the opening section is poor, then you're more than likely not going to have high expectations when you go out to the rest of the game. And that couldn't be farther from the truth because I feel like when you get past that opening section, the game gets better gradually. But that opening section is rough because you're introduced to bad voice acting, you're introduced to a poor combat camera, which will absolutely follow you throughout the entirety of the game, and it just doesn't get you excited for this world, which sucks because I feel like Atlas Fallen has a lot here for people to like. And I've always felt like it was a cardinal sin for most development teams to not have an impactful opener. You have to have a strong opening for a new IP. Otherwise, no one's going to want to play it afterwards. With those three critical issues out of the way, let's talk about some of the things that I really feel like Atlas Fallen nails. The first thing on my list is momentum. Combat in this game is dictated by player momentum. As you are playing this game and as you are going and fighting all of these enemies, you are seeing your momentum meter build. You have assigned passive buffs that will only unlock when your momentum meter reaches that certain section, which means you have the ability to parry for longer periods. You have the ability to increase damage, take less damage, those types of things. And what I love about this is there's kind of this risk reward. When you're continuously doing damage, you're unlocking new abilities that have cooldowns, but it also forces you to be aware in combat and take certain risks, like do you want to dodge or do you want to parry? Because if you take damage at any point in time, your momentum meter slowly decreases. So you have to be aggressive, but you also have to be smart. And I feel like this is a great thing because if you want to do really big damage, You build up that momentum meter until you can shatter. And then from there, you just constantly rebuild. And I really like that in this game because combat, like I said, can be really basic, but the fact that you can add in different passive buffs and different abilities makes it unique in terms of customization, which is something I did not expect when first playing this game. I really thought there would be like more weapons, but I like the fact that there are a number of abilities that you can craft and put into your different meters so that you can have a really optimized build to fight and combat some of these tougher enemies, because sometimes it's best not to utilize your shatter at all. Sometimes it's best to just continuously do damage, wait till your certain abilities cool down, and then utilize those abilities in conjunction with having your passive active. I understand that combat is shallow in Atlas Fallen, but the momentum mechanic really does help overcome some of those concerns because of the emphasis on customization and optimization. Next up, let's briefly talk about the world of Atlas Fallen. I feel like the developers really nailed the look of it. There is just something about this world that you're in that you just want to explore because there's just so many unique areas, and it always feels like you are just a step or two away from getting to this place and finding and uncovering some unique secret about the world, because every time you do go into a different area, you have a number of items that will tell you about the lore of this place and the world itself. And I found that to be great. I just found it to be a world that I enjoyed exploring. I think every biome is unique. I think every biome is fun. I think my biggest highlights are probably the underground worlds. Those are probably my favorite to explore personally because of just how cool it looks. I mean, it's just amazing seeing like this rundown, broken underground kingdom that just collapsed into the earth. I don't know if anyone's ever seen like the original Full Metal Alchemist, but they had that where they had this entire old capital underneath the world, and that's what it kind of looks like in Atlas Fallen, and that was a real highlight for me. Now, the first two things that I listed, I'm pretty sure there are going to be people who are going to say, no, I didn't think the world was too interesting, or they didn't like the fact that the abilities weren't diverse enough, and I understand that. I get it. Okay. But I do not think that it can be contested that traversal in this game is where the developers really nailed it. The first time you sand surf in this game, it is an invigorating experience because your character is surprised, and you're going to be surprised as well because of just how fast you are moving. And it's a unique way to move and traverse around this environment. And it's one of the things that I wish you could do everywhere, but unfortunately it's only on gravel areas or sand areas, in which obviously in Atlas Fallen there is a lot of, but there are certain sections and certain areas of the game in which you cannot sand surf. And I'm here to say, even with that, your character moves really briskly, so you're just kind of zooming no matter what you do. And I like the fact that within the first hour of the game, you get a double jump, you get an air dash, and traversal is really opened up from the start. Like, you're always looking to kind of update these abilities because they want you to explore this world. Getting the double air dash or the triple air dash when that happens opens up exploration in a great way. And I feel like traversal in general in this game is where the devs absolutely nailed it. Because when you are going to solve some of these larger, more intricate puzzles, you will have to platform through different areas. And it's really fun just kind of guiding your character through these different areas and getting your air dashes perfectly. And I feel like I had just a really good time with that sense of freedom, because you float when you air dash, but you have really good control. I never felt at any point in time when I was playing this game that I was frustrated with the platforming or the traversal. I really felt like, for the most part, this was the most enjoyable thing in the game. And I really want to get that sense and scale of speed, because you can get to certain areas that you would probably normally in your head tell yourself you couldn't get to. But in Atlas Fallen, the traversal is fantastic. And because this world has so many different nooks and crannies and platforms that you could raise and all these different shortcuts, it's really fun just being able to kind of cut and zip through these areas. And you look fantastic doing it. I think that's another thing I really loved, is just how stylish you look when you are air dashing and zipping through these areas. It's probably the one thing I feel like the developers really honed in on, is making moving throughout this world enjoyable, because the fast travel system is unfortunately archaic, and you can't fast travel unless you are at an anvil, which is just a certain point in which you can level up your character. But I think because traversal is so fun, I found myself just going, I can probably make it from point A to point B really quickly anyway. So let's just kind of zoom right through. And when I talked about the Watcher earlier, and I talked about how sometimes you're going to run into this enemy that's going to trap you, and then you're going to fight all these different enemies or whatever, and you can either fight them or escape. Escaping is really easy because of just how fast you are moving. When you're in combat, and especially in these wide open areas, you are sand surfing around them, so you are just zipping behind them and stuff. So that's another good way to dodge out of attacks. And I feel like the air dashing is just so much fun to utilize in combat as well. I just feel like traversal, they nailed it. Whatever criticisms you have of this game, I don't think people can really harp on the traversal that much because it is really fun to just kind of zip from point A to point B. Overall, I think a 64 is a little bit too harsh. I think any score under a 6 is kind of questionable. I saw a couple which were like 4s, and I'm like, dude, you got to relax. Like, it's not that bad. I don't think the game is unplayable. I think the game has its technical shortcomings, but I do realize that the introduction for this game, that first opening section, is not good enough. And it's probably going to really set the tone for a lot of players when they get into this game, because when it does open up, I really feel like my stance really softened on this title, but I do feel that that opening section left a bad taste in my mouth because I expected it to not be good the entire time. But instead, I found myself pleasantly surprised about some of the things that I was finding as I continued to navigate the world of Atlas Fallen. But I do maintain what I said about not recommending this game. I think that at this point, you gotta wait till it's on sale. I just don't think that this game is as bad as Metacritic made it out to be. And I know that the score is skewed some because they were some really solid 7s and 6s, and then there was these 2 4s, and I'm like, it's not that bad, man. Like, you throwing out a 4 is like Redfall levels of disappointment, and I don't think Atlas Fallen falls into that category. I just don't. But let me know in the comments what you think, because that's going to do it for this video. If you like the content, please consider sharing, and subscribing. I am Ken from Pixelated Thoughts, and I will talk to you next time.